Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to plunge into a whole stack of information and pull out the most fascinating, the most surprising, and really the most essential insights. Our goal, to help you become truly well-informed. Today, we're tapping into something I think is pretty universal. It's that human pull towards, grand hidden histories. These ideas about catastrophic events that might have completely reshaped our world. I mean, just try to picture it. A time when maybe vast, advanced civilizations thrived, only to be just wiped away, buried, leaving behind these, enigmatic structures that seem to defy easy explanation. That feeling, that intense urge to connect the dots, maybe uncover what's really beneath the surface, well, it fuels some incredibly compelling narratives about our planet's past, and sometimes pretty conflicting ones too. And that's really our mission for this deep dive. We're going to explore some truly intriguing alternative ideas about Earth's history and how our cities and landscapes came to be. First, we'll unpack flood geology.
It's a theory that basically reinterprets the Earth's entire geological record through the lens of one single biblical catastrophe. Then, we'll shift gears a bit and look at the more recent mud flood conspiracy theories. These suggest a hidden, advanced civilization was buried, quite literally, by a global deluge of mud. And finally, we'll ground ourselves. We'll get into the actual geological science, the urban planning science, that explains how cities really do layer up over time and how natural earth movements, like landslides, constantly shape our landscapes. It provides a stark contrast to some of the grander narratives. So our goal here is pretty clear. We want to equip you, our curious listener, with the knowledge you need to navigate these really diverse perspectives. We want to help you distinguish between, say, an intriguing claim, a historical interpretation, and a rigorous scientific explanation. Ultimately, the aim is for you to become truly well-informed about the complex forces, both natural and human, that have shaped our world. Ready to dig in?
Absolutely. Let's get started.
Okay, let's begin with a view of Earth's history that really does challenge conventional scientific understanding. Flood geology. For anyone who hasn't encountered this before, how does this perspective fundamentally reinterpret our planet's past? What's the core idea?
Well, at its heart, flood geology is a comprehensive framework. It looks at Earth's geological features, those vast layers of sedimentary rock you see everywhere, the Grand Canyon, mountain ranges, and the fossils within them, and interprets them as the direct primary result of the biblical Noah's flood. It's deeply rooted in a very literal interpretation of the book of Genesis. The key here is that it views the flood not as just some large local event, but as a global, year-long, cataclysmic deluge that fundamentally reshaped the entire planet in an incredibly short period.
Yeah. So it's really far more than just a big flood story. It's a complete reimagining of, everything. How the Earth physically came to look the way it does today.
Exactly. It's a total paradigm shift from standard geology. And perhaps surprisingly, one of the foundational tenets supporting this view actually comes from a specific theological interpretation. It's the belief that before Adam's original sin, as described back in Genesis 3, there was actually no death among animals, none at all. In that initial perfect pre-fall world, all animals, which they believe were created as distinct species in Genesis 1, were herbivores.
Herbivores.
Yeah.
So no carnivores before the fall.
That's the interpretation. Adam's sin, from this perspective, is what ushered in violence and imperfection, a world where both humans and animals became subject to death. And some animals, they propose, even became carnivores then. This introduction of violence and death is seen theologically as a kind of prelude, setting the stage, making a cleansing event like the flood seem, necessary from that viewpoint.
Okay, I see the theological logic there. What other elements build this pre-flood picture?
Another really fascinating aspect within this framework revolves around those incredibly long lifespans you read about for the patriarchs in Genesis 5 before the flood. Figures like Methuselah living for hundreds and hundreds of years. Flood geologists interpret this as direct evidence of a significant decay, a falling away from that initial state of perfection in the Garden of Eden. This decay, they argue, culminated after the flood in a much shorter maximum human lifespan, settling around the 120 years mentioned later in Genesis.
Interesting. So the long lives point to a different pre-flood world. Was the climate thought to be different too?
Yes, that's another component, though it's seen a bit more skepticism lately, even within the flood geology community. Some early proponents, particularly mid to late 20th century, proposed a dense vapor canopy. They suggested this canopy might have shrouded the pre-flood Earth, creating a totally different global climate, maybe referencing the mist mentioned in Genesis 2.6. But while that specific canopy idea has less support now, the central, absolutely core idea remains the flood event itself. Genesis 7.1 describes it vividly. The windows of heaven were opened, and all the fountains of the great deep were broken up. This signifies for them a global deluge of truly unprecedented scale and power.
So, okay, the flood isn't just a historical or theological event in this view. It's literally the central mechanism for Earth's present-day geology. Every mountain, every canyon, every sedimentary layer we see is a direct result of this single catastrophic year.
Precisely. That's the absolute core of it. From their perspective, the sheer scale of such a global event must have left an immense and unmistakable record across the entire planet. And this record, they contend, is what conventional geology interprets as the geological column formed over millions of years. Flood geology essentially collapses that vast timescale into about 1 year.
Right. So how do they explain specific features like all that sedimentary rock and the fossils inside?
Well, take the formation of sedimentary rock and fossils. A worldwide deluge, they argue, would have unleashed unimaginable erosive power, currents, and sediment transport. It would have deposited vast amounts of rock-forming sediment globally very, very quickly. This rapid deposition for them is the key to explaining how countless organisms were suddenly trapped, buried, and preserved as fossils. They emphasize the rapidity because it helps explain the often intricate preservation we see in fossils, details that might be lost under slower, more gradual deposition and decay.
Okay, rapid burial for fossils. What about huge geological structures? Like how do mountains get built in a year or continents move?
That requires another quite radical concept within their framework, a rapid plate tectonics. Catastrophic plate tectonics, some call it. They propose that during this single year of global flooding, the Earth's tectonic forces went into overdrive. Continents moved incredibly rapidly. So think about South America and Africa separating not over tens or hundreds of millions of years, but potentially splitting apart in just that 1 year.
Wow, that's incredibly fast.
It is. And this rapid movement, combined with what they describe as immense vertical heaving upwards of land masses during or immediately after the flood, is their explanation for major mountain ranges. It also explains, in their view, why we find marine sedimentary rocks formed underwater on the highest mountain peaks today. Even at the summit of Mount Everest, which interestingly is actually composed of marine limestone containing sea life fossils. For them, it's evidence the floodwaters covered even the highest points before the mountains were rapidly uplifted.
Okay, let me try to summarize this. It's a truly comprehensive reimagining of Earth's entire geological history. Millions, even billions of years of conventional geology compressed into a single, catastrophic global flood year, driven by unique pre-flood conditions and ending with rapid tectonic shifts in mountain building.
That's a good summary of the core geological model, yes.
But this raises a really important question, especially when we look closely at the very biblical texts they use as their foundation. What about places or features described in the Bible as existing before the flood, which seem to still exist or be recognizable today? How does that fit into a narrative where the entire landscape was supposedly obliterated and remade?
Ah, yes. This is where the concept faces some truly fascinating and potentially significant challenges. And interestingly, some of these challenges come from within biblical scholarship itself, not just from geology. Let's take the Garden of Eden as a prime example. The Bible, in Genesis 2, describes Eden's location in relation to 4 rivers. 2 of them, the Tigris and the Euphrates, are major rivers we still recognize today in Mesopotamia. The other 2, the Pishon and the Gihon, are described with geographical markers. Scholars have made strong cases identifying the Pishon with the now dried-up Wadi Batin system flowing across Arabia, an area known, just as Genesis says, for gold, bdellium, and onyx stone. And the Gihon is often identified with the Karun River, which flows from the Zagros Mountains in modern-day Iran, historically encompassing the land of Kush.
So the Bible itself seems to be pointing to real, identifiable geography.
It certainly seems that way. The author is describing a landscape with features that can still be recognized, or at least reasonably identified, on our modern map. This implies a continuity of the landscape. And there's another clue later in Genesis 6.14. It mentions Noah's Ark being waterproofed or pitched with bitumen. Bitumen, or natural asphalt, was extensively used in ancient Mesopotamia, exactly Noah's region, for waterproofing boats, buildings, everything. What's fascinating is that the major center of bitumen production back then, and remarkably still today, is at a place called Hit, located right on the Euphrates River. And geologically, Hit is known for its hot springs that bring bitumen up along deep faults in the earth.
Okay, so again, a pre-flood detail linking directly to modern geography and even specific geological features like faults.
Exactly. Now here's the critical point, the potential contradiction for the standard flood geology model. This modern landscape, Mesopotamia, Arabia, the Zagros foothills where Eden and these markers are described, it sits geologically on top of miles of sedimentary rock layers. These are the very layers that conventional geology says took millions of years to form.
Ah, I see the problem.
Right. Flood geologists, by their own core tenet, argue that all or virtually all sedimentary rock containing fossils was deposited by the flood. This would imply that Eden, before the flood, must have existed on some kind of original crystalline basement rock, which was then buried under miles of flood deposits. But the biblical text seems to clearly state that Eden, Noah's activities, these identifiable rivers, were on a landscape that, geographically and geologically, corresponds to the top of these thick sedimentary sequences. It suggests these sedimentary rocks already existed before the flood.
Which directly contradicts the idea that the flood deposited all of them. That's a really significant internal inconsistency based on their primary source text.
It is. It's a point that requires careful consideration within their framework. And it leads to other questions based on biblical interpretation, too.
Like what? Are there other interpretations of the flood story itself?
Yes. For instance, looking at the scale of the flood. Old Testament scholar John Walton has pointed out something interesting about the phrasing in Genesis 7:20. It says, "The flood waters covered the mountains to a depth of more than 20 feet." Now, Walton notes that the Hebrew words used there for covered and mountains are used elsewhere in the Old Testament to describe events that are clearly localized, like floodwaters covering foothills or armies covering hills. It doesn't have to mean covering the highest peaks on the entire globe. So he argues a non-literal, perhaps localized but catastrophic flood interpretation is perfectly plausible just based on the language and context within the Bible itself, without even bringing in external scientific evidence.
That's fascinating. So the interpretation of a global flood isn't necessarily the only way to read the text literally.
According to scholars like Walton, no. And then there's the theological point about death. Remember the idea that Adam's sin brought death to all creatures, necessitating the flood. Well, consider the Apostle Paul's commentary in the New Testament. In Romans 5:1-13, he writes, "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men, because all sinned for before the law was given, sin was in the world." Notice Paul specifically ties the consequence of sin death to humans, all men. He's making a specific theological point about human sin and salvation. He doesn't actually mention animal death as being a consequence of Adam's sin or relevant to his main argument here.
Ah, so the idea that Adam's sin caused animal death, which is a key premise for some flood geology arguments about the pre-flood world, isn't explicitly stated by Paul, who's arguably the key interpreter of sin's consequences.
Exactly. Paul's focus is squarely on humanity. This challenges the theological necessity claimed by some flood geologists that Adam's sin must have introduced death to all creatures, thereby corrupting the whole creation and requiring the flood.
Okay, so we have challenges arising from the geographical descriptions in Genesis, from interpretations of the flood scale within the Bible, and even from New Testament theology regarding the nature of death introduced by sin. It's not just external scientific evidence posing questions.
Precisely. The interaction between the scientific claims and the biblical interpretations is complex, even internally.
Let's bring this down to a specific geological site. The Grand Canyon is often a central showpiece for flood geology arguments, isn't it? How do their claims about its formation stack up against the direct geological observations made there?
Yes, the Grand Canyon is definitely a key location often discussed. Proponents of flood geology put forward specific claims about how it formed during or immediately after Noah's flood. They argue for rapid burial of the sediments forming the canyon walls, deposited by deep, swift currents during the flood year. They also claim there are no significant time gaps between the major rock formations, suggesting rapid, continuous deposition rather than millions of years with periods of erosion or non-deposition. And they often link the carving of the canyon itself to catastrophic drainage of the floodwaters, possibly from large lakes left behind, combined with massive tectonic upheaval that lifted the Colorado Plateau during the flood event.
Okay, so rapid deposition, no time gaps, and catastrophic carving. What does conventional geology say when looking at the same rocks?
Well, the scientific observations present a very different picture, a stark contrast, really. First, consider the diversity of depositional environments. If the Grand Canyon's entire 5,000-foot sequence of sedimentary rock was laid down in a single year-long, miles-deep global flood, You'd expect the rock types and structures to consistently reflect that deep water, high energy, rapid deposition. But that's not what we see. Instead, the layers show a long, complex history involving many different environments. There's clear evidence of deep marine environments, yes, but also shallow water marine settings, coastal tidal flats, river deposits, surfaces that were clearly exposed to the air for long periods, indicated by mud cracks in ancient soil horizons, and even vast desert sand dune deposits frozen in time as sandstone.
Sand dunes in the middle of a global flood.
Exactly. How do you get large-scale desert sand dunes forming underwater, let alone during a turbulent global flood? This variety of environments, stacked vertically, strongly points to changing conditions over vast stretches of time, not a single uniform event.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about those claims of no time gaps?
Geologists identify numerous unconformities within the Grand Canyon sequence. These are surfaces representing significant periods of erosion or non-deposition, essentially, missing time in the rock record. Some of these unconformities represent gaps, potentially lasting millions, even hundreds of millions of years, based on radiometric dating and fossil correlation elsewhere. The idea that the layers were all laid down continuously in 1 year doesn't align with the physical evidence of these major breaks in the sequence.
Okay, so the rock layers themselves tell a story of diverse environments and long time periods with interruptions. What about things within the layers?
That's another compelling area. Think about the preservation of delicate features. Within some of the layers, you find incredibly fine details preserved. Things like ripple marks from gentle water currents, mud cracks from drying surfaces, raindrop impressions, and even tiny, distinct footprints and trackways left by reptiles and other small creatures walking across soft sediment.
Footprints, like little claw marks.
Yes, sometimes even preserving the detail of claw marks. Now imagine trying to make and preserve such fragile impressions under the conditions proposed for a global flood, miles deep water, incredibly turbulent currents, massive sediment flows. It seems impossible.
It'd just be instantly erased, wouldn't they?
You'd certainly expect them to be obliterated. The preservation of such delicate features strongly suggests much calmer conditions. Animals walking across exposed mud flats, living prints that then had time to harden slightly, perhaps bake in the sun, before being gently buried by the next layer of sediment. This points to sequential deposition over extended periods, with surfaces stable enough to record these fleeting moments.
So the Grand Canyon, rather than being prime evidence for a single global flood, actually seems to present significant challenges to that interpretation when you look closely at the details within the rocks.
From the perspective of mainstream geology, yes. The diversity of environments, the evidence of long time gaps, and the preservation of delicate features all point towards a much longer, more complex geological history, involving gradual processes operating over millions of years rather than a single year-long catastrophe.
This really does highlight that fundamental tension, doesn't it? Between a specific framework derived from a literal interpretation of a text and the detailed story told by the physical evidence found in the Earth itself. It's a powerful example of how different starting points can lead to vastly different conclusions when looking at the exact same phenomenon.
It absolutely is. And it sets the stage nicely for looking at other alternative interpretations of history and landscape.
Definitely. Okay, let's shift gears now. We're moving away from ancient floods and into a more modern set of ideas that also question established timelines and histories, but maybe with a different kind of cataclysm. This is where we encounter theories that have gained, well, quite a bit of traction in certain online communities. I'm talking about the Great Reset and mud flood theories. What exactly are these ideas claiming? What's the basic premise?
Right. These are fascinating because they circulate primarily within online pseudo-archaeological communities, often outside of mainstream academic discussion. But they posit something quite radical. That our current civilization isn't as original or perhaps even as advanced as we tend to believe. The Great Reset idea, broadly speaking, suggests that some kind of global event, not necessarily a geological one this time, maybe societal, maybe technological, maybe even something more mysterious, wiped out a prior technologically sophisticated global civilization. And our modern society, according to this theory, is effectively just reintroducing or rediscovering fragments of their lost knowledge and technology. The mud flood theory is a more specific and often overlapping subset of this. It focuses specifically on a supposed global mud deluge, a literal flood of mud that they claim buried the lower levels of grand old world-style buildings all across the planet, perhaps just a few centuries ago.
A global mud flood burying the ground floors of old buildings worldwide.
Yeah.
Okay. So for people who subscribe to these theories, what kind of evidence do they point to? What makes them believe such a dramatic hidden history exists?
They often focus on things they perceive as anomalies or inconsistencies in the standard historical narrative, particularly concerning architecture and infrastructure from, say, the 18th and especially the 19th centuries. They look at what they consider out-of-place architecture, structures that seem too grand, too complex, or too numerous for the accepted technological capabilities and population sizes of the time.
Can you give some examples of what they mean by out of place?
Sure. A primary piece of their evidence centers on the sheer scale and perceived sophistication of grandiose buildings found globally from that era. Think elaborate government buildings, opera houses, train stations, often with towering domes, incredibly detailed classical facades, intricate stonework. They also highlight complex geometric star forts, those polygonal military fortifications. While history documents their development and purpose, theorists sometimes see them as evidence of a lost, advanced understanding of geometry or even energy.
Okay, so grand buildings and star forts, what's the argument about them?
The core argument is often one of implausibility. They ask, how could these massive structures, requiring vast quantities of quarried stone, brick, timber, and complex engineering, have been built and transported, sometimes to relatively remote areas, using only the horse-drawn carts and basic tools historians describe for the period? They'll show photos, for example, of quite isolated towns in the American West or elsewhere in the 19th century, with maybe just dirt roads and a small population, yet dominated by an enormous ornate courthouse or city hall that looks like it belongs in a major European capital. This visual incongruity fuels the idea that these structures must be remnants, inherited from a previous, more advanced civilization, not built by the settlers we know about.
I can see how that visual contrast could spark questions if you're not thinking about, say, civic pride, funding mechanisms, or architectural trends at the time. What about specific examples they point to?
Yes, they often highlight specific examples. Fort Bourtange in the Netherlands, a 16th century star fort, is sometimes mentioned. Its perfect symmetry and complex geometry are presented as almost too precise, hinting at mysterious ingenuity beyond the known capabilities of the era. In North America, they might point to the Montana State Capitol building, completed around 1902. Photos show it standing somewhat isolated in a large field, looking very grand, and they interpret this as appearing timeless and ancient, as if transplanted. Or the Legislative Building in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Its imposing dome and intricate design are argued to be far beyond what early settlers of what was initially a simple fur trading outpost could realistically achieve with the limited resources supposedly available. The argument boiled down to the scale and quality seem mismatched with the historical context.
Right, the "it just doesn't add up" argument based on visual interpretation. It's easy to see the appeal of that line of reasoning if you feel something is being hidden. What other types of evidence do these theories draw on?
Another really interesting area for these theorists revolves around the great world fairs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Events like the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago or the 1900 Paris Exposition. They look at the incredibly elaborate, often enormous temporary structures built for these fairs, the White City in Chicago, for example. Instead of seeing them as demonstrations of contemporary industrial might and architectural trends, often using temporary materials like staff, a kind of plaster and fiber mixture, they propose something else. They suggest these fairs were actually part of a deliberate, orchestrated plan by some controlling group to reintroduce lost architectural styles, technologies, or cultural knowledge to a society that was supposedly recovering from this great reset or mud flood.
Reintroduce, as in pretend it was new.
Essentially, yes. And the fact that these massive, intricate structures were often rapidly dismantled right after the fairs concluded adds fuel to their suspicion. Instead of seeing it as the planned demolition of temporary exhibits, they interpret it as a deliberate effort to prevent the public from scrutinizing these rediscovered designs or technologies too closely.
Okay, that's a different angle. What else? You mentioned infrastructure earlier.
Yes, sophisticated train technology is another common theme. Proponents share photographic evidence from the 1800s and early 1900s showing what they argue is train technology, railway networks, and grand station architecture that seems far more sophisticated than expected for the time. They point to extensive, intricately engineered railway lines crossing vast, difficult terrains, mountains, deserts. They question how these massive networks, requiring precise surveying, grading, tunneling, bridge building, and the manufacture of complex locomotives and rolling stock, could have been achieved so quickly and widely with supposedly primitive tools and methods. This leads them to speculate that perhaps the core technology wasn't entirely newly invented during the Industrial Revolution, but maybe reintroduced or adapted from this hypothesized earlier, more advanced civilization.
So this narrative weaves together these perceived anomalies, the architecture, the fares, the trains, with logistical questions about construction capabilities. It paints a picture of a hidden past, a lost world. Where do these theories, especially this Tartarian idea some people mention, ultimately lead? What's the bigger picture within this kind of conspiratorial thinking?
Right, that's where it gets really interesting and often quite complex. These Great Reset and mud flood ideas frequently converge with, or are part of, a broader, more elaborate conspiracy theory, often referred to as the Tartarian Empire, or simply Tartaria. This Tartaria concept is often used as the name for the supposed lost global technologically advanced civilization. And the way knowledge about it is framed fits neatly into categories often seen in conspiracy theories. One researcher, Michael Barkun, described these forms of stigmatized knowledge. Proponents might see Tartarian knowledge as forgotten knowledge, things once widely known but lost due to a cataclysm like the mud flood. They also see it as rejected knowledge claims that mainstream authorities, like academics or governments, explicitly dismiss as false from the outset. And crucially, they often frame it as suppressed knowledge information that institutions know to be true but are deliberately hiding from the public, perhaps out of fear of the consequences, or for more malicious reasons like maintaining control.
Okay, so forgotten, rejected, and suppressed. How does that apply to specific claims, like about the architecture?
Well, take the concept of antique tech that often comes up in Tartarian discussions. This is the idea that many of those grand old world buildings, particularly those with prominent domes, spires, or antenna-like features, weren't just aesthetically pleasing or structurally necessary. Instead, they claim these features were actually functional components of a system designed to harvest free energy directly from the ether, a kind of ambient universal energy field. The buildings acted as giant energy collectors or transmitters. So this antique tech fits all three categories. It's forgotten, lost after the mud flood supposedly destroyed the system. It's rejected, scoffed at by mainstream physics and engineering. And it's suppressed, hidden by powerful elites who supposedly co-opted this free energy tech for their own control, perhaps preventing figures like Nikola Tesla from fully realizing similar concepts.
Free energy harvested by old buildings. Wow. So it's not just a forgotten past of grand architecture, but a deliberately hidden history involving revolutionary energy secrets that were stolen or kept from the masses. That definitely adds a whole other layer of intrigue and, well, distrust of established systems.
Absolutely. It taps into very powerful themes of hidden power, suppressed potential, and a sense of being cheated out of a better world.
But why do you think these specific Tartarian elements, linking mud floods to free energy and suppressed history, resonate so strongly with certain groups online? What's the deeper appeal?
Well, it connects to several things, I think. Firstly, this anti-tech and the broader Tartarian narrative often don't exist in isolation. They frequently intertwine with a much wider network, a kind of ecosystem of other conspiracy theories. You'll often find links or overlaps with flat earth theories, chemtrail conspiracies, ideas about a controlling new world order, or various anti-government or anti-elite sentiments. It suggests a vast interconnected conspiracy where a shadowy group is secretly manipulating world events, history, and technology. This linkage provides a seemingly comprehensive, if unfounded, explanation for who might be behind the supposed reset and why this amazing knowledge has been suppressed.
So it offers a grand, unified theory of sorts for various perceived anomalies or grievances.
In a way, yes. It provides a narrative that seems to connect many dots for those who are already distrustful of mainstream sources. Secondly, it's important, though sensitive, to note the origins of some specific Tartarian elements. Research has shown that the notion of a secret lost Tartarian empire as a global power actually has roots in certain strains of pseudoscientific Russian nationalism. It emerged partly as a fringe narrative attempting to reposition Russia or a mythical Slavic Tartar entity as the rightful inheritors or rulers of a lost superior world order. There's often significant historical confusion embedded in these theories, too. For instance, you sometimes see Genghis Khan, the actual historical founder of the vast Mongolian Empire, bizarrely described as the founding father of this mythical global Tartarian Empire. This stems from a real lack of engagement with, or perhaps deliberate distortion of, established historical knowledge about Central Asia and the Mongol conquests.
It's quite a historical leap. So nationalism and historical confusion play a role.
Yeah.
What about the engineering claims themselves, like the free energy?
Right, that's the third key aspect. A critical component of these theories relies on profound misinterpretations, or perhaps a complete disregard of basic, well-understood principles of engineering, architecture, and historical construction practices. The claim, for example, that these supposed Tartarians built all major pyramids, all bastion forts, all medieval castles, and all classical-style domed buildings across the entire globe just ignores centuries of architectural history and engineering development. Pyramids, for instance, were simply the most stable and practical way to build extremely tall, massive structures using stone masonry before the development of more advanced techniques like strong arches, vaults, or later steel frames. It's a matter of structural mechanics, not lost alien tech. Similarly, those star-shaped bastion forts. Their distinctive angular design was a direct, logical, and well-documented military innovation specifically developed in the age of gunpowder to better withstand cannon fire and provide overlapping fields of defensive fire. It wasn't about harvesting energy, it was about survival on the battlefield.
So these architectural forms were logical solutions to the problems and technologies of their actual time, not remnants of some mysterious energy-harvesting past civilization.
Precisely. The designs were driven by factors like available materials, structural limitations, military necessity, aesthetic trends, and civic ambition, all things well documented by historians and engineers. They don't require a lost super civilization or free energy devices to explain them.
It's quite a narrative, the Tartarian one. Definitely compelling if you're looking for hidden explanations and grand conspiracies. But it really brings us back to the question, what are the real established explanations for the things these theories try to account for? Like why old cities seem to have buried lower levels? How does that actually happen, if not by a global mud flood?
That's the perfect transition. We've explored these imaginative, speculative explanations for mysterious buildings and seemingly buried structures. Now let's ground ourselves firmly in what archaeology, geology, urban planning, and history actually tell us about how cities get layered over time. Because this layering phenomenon, which is absolutely real and observable worldwide, think of ancient sites like Rome, where excavations have revealed an incredible 25 distinct layers of city life built one atop the other, is a very well understood process. And it's driven not by a sudden global mud catastrophe, but by a combination of practical human decisions, economic realities, natural processes, and the sheer passage of time. It's actually a fascinating story in itself.
Okay, so not a mud flood. How do cities end up with buried layers then? What's the mechanism?
There are several key factors that contribute, and they usually work together. First, think about the strategic location of cities. Historically, cities weren't founded randomly. They grew up in places that offered advantages. Safe harbors, river crossings, defensible positions, access to trade routes, fertile land, mountain passes, oases, and deserts. These prime locations often remain advantageous for centuries, even millennia. So when one settlement in that location declines, gets damaged, or is destroyed by war, fire, or natural disaster, it's very common for new settlements to simply rise directly on the remnants of the old one. People keep coming back to the good spot.
Right, location, location, location. So people rebuild on the same spot, but why build on top of the old stuff? Why not clear it away first?
That brings us to the second major factor. The immense challenge and cost of demolition, especially in pre-industrial times. Imagine trying to completely demolish a substantially built structure, maybe stone walls, heavy timber frames, deep foundations using only hand tools like shovels, picks, levers, and maybe animal power. It was incredibly labor-intensive, time-consuming, and therefore very expensive. You wouldn't just be knocking down walls. You'd ideally want to dig out the foundations and then haul away literally tons upon tons of rubble. Where would you even put it all?
Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare task without modern excavators and dump trucks.
Exactly. So what was often the much easier, faster, more practical, and certainly more economical path, when a building became dilapidated, infested, damaged, or simply needed replacement, it was to simply build on the rubble. You'd knock down the unstable parts of the old walls, maybe salvage reusable materials like timbers or good stones, and then use the rest of the debris, along with perhaps household trash and soil brought in from elsewhere, to fill in the lower levels or the old foundation. You'd level off this fill material with something like gravel or sand, creating a new higher ground surface, and then lay a new floor and build your new walls right on top of the old footprint. This process, repeated over generations, naturally and inevitably causes the ground level of the city to rise.
That makes perfect practical sense. You're essentially using the old city as the foundation for the new one. Do we have clear examples of this?
Oh, absolutely. We have fantastic, well-documented examples, even relatively recently in the United States. You mentioned Eureka Springs, Arkansas, earlier. It has a famous street called Mud Street, right down in the valley. It apparently earned its name, honestly, because being at the low point, it would frequently flood and turn into a muddy mess. So rather than constantly battling the water and mud at the original level, the city decided at some point to essentially raise the street level. They built retaining walls and filled it in, bringing the street up one story. This effectively turned the original ground floors of the buildings along that street into basements. And today, you can actually take tours or look down through sidewalk grates and see the original storefronts and doorways buried below the current street. It's a direct, visible result of this raising process.
Wow, that's concrete proof right there. Any other U.S. examples?
Yes, several famous ones. After the Great Seattle Fire of 1889 destroyed much of the downtown, the city made a conscious decision during rebuilding. They decided to regrade the streets, raising them significantly sometimes by 1 or even 2 stories, primarily for better drainage and sanitation, to allow sewers to flush directly into Puget Sound at high tide. This created the famous Seattle Underground, where the original street level and ground floors of many rebuilt buildings became subterranean spaces. It wasn't a mud flood, it was deliberate post-fire urban engineering. Chicago did something similar, though perhaps even more ambitious in the mid-1800s. Much of the downtown was originally swampy and prone to flooding. So engineers undertook an incredible project to physically raise the street level and even entire existing buildings using thousands of jack screws by as much as 12 feet in some areas, while installing a new sewer system underneath. Again, pragmatic urban improvement, not a mysterious cataclysm. Chattanooga, Tennessee, also raised parts of its downtown by about 12 feet because of frequent flooding from the Tennessee River, leaving accessible underground areas.
And this isn't just an American thing, right?
Not at all. It's a global phenomenon wherever cities have existed for a long time. There are reports from Guiyang, China, where a main street was raised 3 to 4 meters, turning original ground floors into basements. And you even see it reflected in fiction, like Terry Pratchett's wonderfully described City of Ankh-Morpork in his Discworld novels, which is explicitly built layer upon layer on its own accumulated sludge and ruins after centuries of fires, floods, and just general accretion. He really captured the essence of this process.
So human rebuilding is a major factor. What about natural processes? Does the Earth itself contribute to burying old cities?
Yes, absolutely. There's also natural accumulation. Dust, silt blown by wind, decaying organic matter, it all gradually builds up over time, especially in urban environments where human activity stirs things up. Even a few millimeters of dust accumulating daily doesn't sound like much, but over hundreds or thousands of years, particularly in an abandoned or neglected area, this slow, steady deposition can significantly raise the ground level and gradually consume old structures, burying lower levels.
Okay, so rebuilding on rubble, raising street levels deliberately, and slow natural accumulation. Any other factors?
One more practical one is simply repurposing old foundations. Modern construction crews, when excavating for a new building, often accidentally discover buried foundation walls from previous structures on the site. If these old foundations are still sound and stable, it's often much quicker and cheaper for them to simply integrate them into the new building's foundation system rather than going to the trouble and expense of removing them completely. So, remnants of the past get incorporated directly into the present.
And sometimes different layers just represent different eras of development, right? Like a pre-car city looking very different from a post-WWII suburban sprawl built around it.
Exactly. City layers aren't always just vertical physical layers. They can also represent distinct eras of planning and technology. Think about American cities. The dense, walkable downtowns built before the automobile, then the rings of streetcar suburbs, then the vast post-World War II expansion designed entirely around cars with different street layouts, building styles, and infrastructure. These are horizontal layers representing different times and priorities.
It really paints a much richer, more complex, and frankly more logical picture than a single mud flood event. What looks like a mystery from one perspective, buried ground floors, out-of-place buildings, becomes a completely understandable consequence of human ingenuity, economic pressures, sanitation needs, dealing with recurring natural events like floods, and simply the passage of time when viewed through the lens of history, archaeology, and urban planning.
Precisely. The real story is often more intricate and interesting than the conspiracy theory.
Speaking of recurring natural events, you mentioned floods. Let's talk about other ways the Earth itself moves and shapes our environment, sometimes quite dramatically. How do real geological processes, like landslides, shape our world and interact with human development? It feels like we often underestimate the continuous dynamic power of the Earth right beneath our feet, maybe focusing too much on looking for one big ancient cataclysm.
You've hit on a really critical point there. While some theories are searching for that single, grand, catastrophic event to explain major changes, geology shows us that the Earth is constantly dynamically changing through a whole variety of processes, many of which are powerful but often localized. Landslides are a perfect example of this ongoing Earth movement. Studying landslides gives us real, verifiable insight into how landscapes evolve naturally, and also how human activity can inadvertently trigger or worsen these very real hazards.
So what exactly is a landslide, technically speaking? Is it just any time dirt falls down a hill?
It's a bit more specific than that, though that's the general idea. A landslide is technically a form of mass wasting, which is the umbrella term for the downslope movement of rock, soil, and debris under the influence of gravity. What typically distinguishes a landslide is that the movement occurs along a specific surface or zone of failure within the earth material. It's not just loose stuff rolling down. A whole chunk or block of ground breaks loose and moves, often somewhat coherently, at least initially.
Okay, so there's a failure surface. Are there different types of landslides based on how they move?
Yes, absolutely. Scientists have classified them in various ways over the years. C.F. Stewart Sharp did early work in 1938, but a widely used classification came from David Varnes of the U.S. Geological Survey in 1978, later refined with David Cruden. They defined 5 main groups based on the type of movement. Falls, like rockfall where material detaches and drops. Topples, where a block pivots or rotates forward. Slides, where material moves along a distinct surface. Spreads, involving lateral extension and movement. And flows, where the material moves like a viscous fluid.
Slides seem common. Are there different kinds of slides?
Yes, 2 main types are often distinguished within slides. A rotational slide typically occurs in softer materials like soil or weak rock. The failure surface is curved, concave upwards like the shape of a spoon, so the block of ground actually rotates backwards slightly as it slumps downwards and outwards. A translational slide, on the other hand, tends to move along a relatively flat, planar surface. This surface is often a pre-existing weakness, like a bedding plane between rock layers, a fault line, or the contact between soil and underlying bedrock. The block slides more or less straight down or out without much rotation, maybe like a book sliding off a tilted shelf. And then you get complex landslides that might start as one type, say a slump, rotational slide, and then transition into an earth flow further downslope.
Okay, different ways things can move. But what actually causes a slope to fail? What are the key factors that make a hillside unstable enough to suddenly give way?
Well, fundamentally, geology is king. The inherent stability of any slope depends heavily on its underlying geological structure, the types of rock and soil present, how the layers are oriented, the presence of faults or fractures. Some materials are just naturally weaker or more prone to failure than others.
Is there any particular material that's notorious for causing landslides?
Yes, there definitely is, especially in certain regions like parts of California. It's a type of clay mineral called montmorillonite. This clay has a remarkable, almost alarming chemical property. It can absorb an incredible amount of water into its molecular structure, sometimes up to 800% of its own dry weight. When montmorillonite clay gets saturated, it swells dramatically and transforms into an extremely slippery, low-strength goo. It acts like a lubricant within the soil mass. Even if it only makes up a small percentage of the total soil, say 5%, its behavior can dominate and control the stability of the entire slope. Some formations, like the Orinda Formation in California, can have zones with 45–50% montmorillonite, making them exceptionally prone to sliding.
Wow, 800% water absorption. So water is obviously a huge factor then.
Enormous. Moisture content and precipitation are probably the most common triggers for landslides worldwide. Heavy, sustained rainfall is a major culprit. As rainwater infiltrates the ground, it fills the tiny spaces, the pores, between soil particles or within rock fractures. This increases the pore water pressure. Essentially, the water pressure pushes outwards, counteracting the forces holding the particles together, the shear strength, and effectively reducing the friction along potential failure surfaces. If the pore pressure gets high enough, it can float the material and allow gravity to take over. You see a very clear correlation in many areas between intense storm seasons or periods of prolonged heavy rainfall and increased landslide activity. Historical records, like those from Contra Costa County in California, clearly link major storm years, 1904, 1936, 1967, 1986, etc., with widespread landsliding.
Okay, geology and water. What else can push a slope over the edge?
Seismic activity is another important factor. Earthquakes can trigger landslides in several ways. The intense ground shaking itself can cause soils to lose strength, a process called liquefaction in some cases, or simply jolt unstable masses loose. Earthquakes can also reactivate landslides that were previously dormant or moving very slowly. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake, for example, famously occurred at the end of a very wet winter season, and the combination of saturated ground and strong shaking, lasting up to 43 seconds in some places, triggered or reactivated numerous large landslides throughout the region. Even smaller, localized earthquake swarms can sometimes contribute to gradual weakening or sudden failure of slopes.
Makes sense. Shaking unstable ground isn't good. What about us? Do human activities play a role?
A huge role. Human intervention, often referred to as anthropogenic disturbance by geologists, is a major contributing factor to landslide occurrence and risk, especially in developed areas. Things like road cuts and grading for construction are prime examples. When you cut into the base of a hillside to make way for a road or a building pad, you are essentially removing the natural support, the toe, of the slope above. This steepens the slope and can easily destabilize it, especially if the underlying geology is weak or contains potential failure surfaces. We saw that example in Orinda, California, where cutting the highway through the toe of a massive ancient landslide feature led directly to its reactivation during heavy rains. Similarly, placing heavy fill material on the upper part of a slope for construction can overload it, increasing the driving forces for a slide. Or simply building on known unstable ground without proper engineering is asking for trouble. The construction of Lafayette Dam, also near Orinda, was famously delayed for 2 years back in 1928 because a huge landslide occurred within the embankment during construction. Turns out it was founded on soft, unstable, ancient landslide deposits and mudflow material, collevium. They had to completely redesign it. And there are numerous cases, like the Xander Drive landslide in 1970, where homes built on engineered fill placed over an older landslide were destroyed when the underlying instability was reactivated, often by rainfall or landscape irrigation.
It sounds like understanding the geology before you build is absolutely critical then. How do geologists figure this out? How do they investigate and try to prevent these kinds of disasters?
It involves a combination of techniques, really. Geological mapping is fundamental. Engineering geologists conduct detailed reconnaissance mapping in the field, looking for telltale signs of past or present instability. Things like hummocky topography, lumpy ground, scarps, steep breaks and slope where a slide started, tilted trees, or deranged drainage patterns, streams that seem to wander illogically. They also make extensive use of aerial photographs, especially historical ones viewed in stereo pairs, which provide a 3D perspective. Old aerial photos, sometimes dating back to the 1920s or 30s, are invaluable because they show the landscape before modern development obscured many features, often revealing subtle evidence of ancient, giant landslides, relic landslides, that might otherwise be missed. Crenulated or wrinkled-looking contours on topographic maps are another clue geologists look for, often indicating slow earth flow movement.
So, looking at the surface clues, what about what's happening underground? That seems crucial for finding those failure surfaces.
Absolutely. Subsurface investigation is key. This involves drilling boreholes into the slope. Geologists can then visually inspect the soil and rock samples brought up, cores, or even lower instruments or cameras down the hole. Downhole logging, sometimes in large diameter borings a geologist can physically be lowered into, to directly observe the geological structure, identify weak layers like those Montmorillonite clays, and locate the depth of the failure surface. A critical tool used in boreholes is the inclinometer. This is essentially a probe that measures the tilt or inclination at different depths within a special casing installed in the borehole. By taking repeated measurements over time, geologists can detect exactly where subsurface movement is occurring, how deep the slide is, and how fast it's moving. It can show zones of active shearing, compression at the toe, or extension at the head of the slide. Other techniques include cone penetration tests, CPT, which push an instrumented cone into the ground to measure soil resistance and properties continuously, and sometimes seismic exploration methods to map subsurface layers.
Okay, so they map the surface, probe the subsurface. Once they identify a potential or active landslide hazard, what can actually be done about it? How do you mitigate the risk?
Mitigation strategies depend heavily on the specific site conditions and the type of landslide, but common approaches focus on two main things: reducing the driving forces, like weight and water pressure, and increasing the resisting forces, the strength of the slope. Water management is almost always critical. This can involve installing horizontal subdrains, perforated pipes drilled deep into the slope to intercept groundwater and drain it away, reducing those dangerous poor water pressures. Surface water control is also vital, using things like concrete-lined interceptor ditches to capture rainwater runoff and channel it safely away from the unstable area, preventing infiltration. Grading is another common technique. This might involve removing weight from the upper part of the landslide mass, or conversely, adding a stabilizing berm or buttress of heavy fill at the toe of the slope to resist movement. Sometimes unstable materials are simply excavated and replaced with stronger engineered fill, or the slope is laid back to a gentler, more stable angle. Following disastrous storm damage and landslides in the late 1960s, places like Contra Costa County significantly amended their grading ordinances to incorporate more conservative design requirements and limitations based on the geological investigations, recognizing the need for proactive hazard reduction.
It sounds like there's a real science to managing landslide risk. You mentioned slow movement sometimes.
Yes, that's an important concept called creep. Some landslides don't fail catastrophically all at once. They can move very slowly, maybe inches per year over long periods. This slow, continuous deformation is called creep. However, as the great Carl Terzaghi, considered the father of soil mechanics, pointed out back in 1950, this creep can gradually weaken the soil structure along the failure surface. It can creep itself to rupture, meaning the flow movement eventually leads to a drop in shear strength, potentially culminating in a sudden catastrophic failure. Measuring this creep rate, as was done before the tragic 1963 Vajont Reservoir landslide in Italy, is crucial for understanding the potential for future rapid movement and informs modern engineering monitoring and design.
It's truly eye-opening to see the level of scientific rigor and detailed investigation that goes into understanding these dynamic Earth processes. The way geologists combine surface mapping, historical photo analysis, subsurface drilling, instrumentation, and an understanding of material properties to diagnose and mitigate these hazards. It's incredibly complex.
It really is.
And the contrast between these detailed, evidence-based explanations for how landscapes change and how human development interacts with them, compared to the grand, simplified, often single-cause narratives of things like a global mud flood or even some interpretations of flood geology, is just stark.
Yeah.
What looks like an inexplicable anomaly through one lens becomes a predictable, understandable process through the lens of careful scientific observation and analysis.
That's a very good way to put it. The complexity is where the real understanding lies.
Okay, as we start to wrap up this deep dive, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? We journeyed from ancient biblical interpretations of global floods, digging into the core tenets of flood geology, and also the very real challenges it faces, challenges from geology, yes, but also from careful readings of the biblical texts themselves. Then we shifted into the more modern, digitally fueled world of conspiracy theories, exploring the mud flood and Great Reset narratives. We looked at the kinds of evidence proponents point to the out-of-place architecture, the world fairs, the train tech, and the broader Tartarian framework involving suppressed knowledge and free energy that often underpins these ideas. And finally, we really grounded ourselves back in the observable world, looking at the established scientific and historical explanations for how our cities genuinely do layer up over centuries of human activity, economic decisions, and natural processes. And we explored the dynamic reality of how the Earth itself constantly moves through powerful, yet often localized geological processes like landslides, and how we study and interact with those forces.
It's been quite a journey across different ways of seeing the past and the present. And I think the common thread running through all of it isn't just about floods or buildings or geology, is it? It's really about something more fundamental. It's about how we interpret the world around us, how we construct narratives to make sense of what we see, and how we choose which evidence to prioritize or which framework to adopt. We've seen that while these speculative narratives, these alternative histories, can be incredibly compelling, they often weave together disparate observations into a dramatic, easily digestible story. The process of detailed scientific and historical inquiry, though perhaps more painstaking, ultimately provides a far richer, more nuanced, and critically, a much more actionable understanding of our planet and our collective past. It's an understanding built on testable evidence and rigorous methodology.
And that kind of understanding, that ability to discern and evaluate, feels profoundly crucial, doesn't it? It's not just something for academics in ivory towers or geologists out in the field. It's vital for all of us, living our lives in these layered cities on this dynamic planet. Whether it's appreciating the genuine, complex history embedded in the foundations of an old part of town, understanding why our ancestors often built on top of ruins instead of clearing them away, or recognizing the very real, present-day geological hazards like landslides that impact our communities and demand careful engineering and planning, the skill of distinguishing between well-tested knowledge and appealing but unverified claims seems more important now than ever before. It really empowers us, doesn't it? To make better decisions as individuals and communities, to build safer, more resilient places to live, and just to have a more accurate, more appreciative view of the incredible forces, both human and natural, that have shaped and continue to shape our world.
Well said. That critical thinking muscle is essential.
So, as we leave you today, here's maybe one final provocative thought to chew on, something to carry forward from our discussion. Consider how our understanding of the very ground beneath our feet, whether we see it through the lens of slow, almost imperceptible accumulation of dust, gradually burying old street levels, or through the deliberate, practical human act of building new structures right on top of the ruins of old ones, or through the sudden, raw, terrifying power of a natural landslide, reshaping a hillside in mere moments. Consider how that understanding shapes not just our physical environment, but also the very stories we tell ourselves. The stories about our past, about human capabilities, about nature's power, and about our own place within it all. Which narrative makes the most sense of the evidence? Which one helps us navigate the future more effectively? Which narrative will you choose to explore further, and why? That's it for this deep dive. We sincerely hope you feel a little more well-informed and perhaps a lot more curious. Until next time.